There's a new way to stay connected and know what's happening with Market to Market when you subscribe to Market Insider. One email and a lot of information awaits you. Go to markettomarket.org and subscribe to Market Insider. What does modern agriculture look like? It could be something that's heavy on crop rotation, cover crops, technology that way. It could be pipelines with carbon. It could be a heavy use of chemical or just a use of chemical. We're going to talk about that this week in the M2M podcast with the executive director of the Modern Ag Alliance. It's Elizabeth Burns-Thompson. She's a return guest. She's worked in many different areas of agriculture to give her a perspective that we will talk about in this discussion, what she has been doing in the first few months of 2025. And that's go to various state houses across the country with the organization to talk about a certain bill when it comes to chemicals and labeling. We'll talk about tools in the toolbox for farmers, how that's helping, how the campaign and polling is talking about the issue, and we'll also kind of get into some legal things and just kind of help straighten out what this bill says and what it doesn't. That's today's installment of the M2M podcast. I'm Paul Yeager. Thanks for watching, listening, or reading. New episodes of this podcast come out each and every Tuesday. Let's get to our discussion. It has been a while, and since you've been last on this podcast, but a return guest, you've had a couple of different opportunities since we last talked. Let's see. There's been corn, there's been fuel, and now the Modern Ag Alliance. I mean, what's your path been here the last few years, Elizabeth?
Yes, well, thank you for having me back, Paul. It's truly an honor. But yeah, I tell folks I've had a great, I've had a wonderful opportunities throughout my career to work with and for farmers in a lot of really cutting edge issues. Some of them more popular, I would say, than others over the years, but certainly it's been fun to be kind of on the cutting edge of something that's new, different, and really impactful. And I would argue much the same here with hopefully what we're going to talk about here today.
Well, the issues of agriculture everybody kind of has a different view of an issue, but it's still about feeding and fueling the world, I assume is what you're finding?
Absolutely. At its core is, protection of our ability to provide an abundant, safe, and affordable food supply. And I'd say food and fuel, right? We're from Middle America. For listeners that may not know, I'm originally from Iowa. My family still farms on the eastern side of the state. And, I look at food, fuel, fiber. Farmers are bringing all of those things forward each and every day. And so, I have had the great opportunity to work in a variety of different sectors within that supply chain, and now very recently taking on some of the input side challenges that farmers have faced very recently.
It's kind of hard to miss Modern Ag Alliance as you drive through certain parts of the country. You see billboards, you see advertisements that show up in social media. So tell me how you view what the organization is.
Sure. So I joined Modern Ag here at the first part of this year. The entity itself has been around for a little over a year, actually, and really was started to kind of tee up against some of the challenges that specifically crop protection chemistries have faced. Right now, we sit just over 100 different organizations across the country. I used to say coast to coast, but we do have some wonderful partners even outside of the coastal regions in Hawaii. So agriculture is different from region to region, but the challenges are very similar. And so, partnering together with commodity associations, your state farm bureaus and farmers unions and agribusiness groups, and many of those organizations' national counterparts as well, kind of coming together, recognizing that, farmers have some real challenges on keeping tools in their toolbox. And what we're focused on, at least in the immediate short run, is providing some certainty and some clarity to ensure that, crop protection chemistries that we have available today continue to be available, and that those processes are put in place such that that there's still a viable R&D supply chain, so that we have new technologies coming to us, as my generation is farming and the next generation comes into it.
You mentioned chemistry a lot, and I've seen that in a lot of the literature. Is that kind of where the focus is with this group?
Absolutely. So, if you kind of take a step back and look at the real threats to chemistry. So when I'm talking about chemistries, some folks call them crop protection tools. I've used the term chemistries. These are your pesticides, your herbicides, your insecticides, your rodenticides, all of those things that farmers are depending upon to manage pests. What we have seen in the last, I would argue, 5 to 10 years, really, is an exponential growth in the amount of litigation that has been targeted against these industries, really threatening the viability of many of these tools, many moving forward. A lot of that has transpired kind of in focus on glyphosate, or what many folks know of as Roundup. I'm sure all of your listeners have seen some type of the advertisements in that campaign as well. And a bulk of that litigation and those lawsuits are revolving specifically around what is called failure to warn, or the component pieces of what can or should be part of that label. And so, at the crux of what we are working on, and what I do each and every day with our partners, is to try to proactively work on legislation at the state level. Initially, we also have some collaborative work that we're doing on the federal level to provide some consistency and clarity, to try to slow down some of that litigation, or what we would call meritless lawsuits.
Well, and you have that law background, so you're going to have to walk me through some of those legal terms. I mean, there's clearly someone thinks a lawsuit has merit when they bring it forward. But there's also protections and reasonableness, and then there's the argument of what is reasonable and what the average person should assume is a risk. I mean, there's a lot of complex lanes, but there's also a lot of opportunities. I think might be a word that you think some are seen as a way to make money or to drag things then through court.
Yes. So as you mentioned, Paul, yeah, I do have a law background. So a nod to my alma mater there at Drake. I would say, just to take a step back, if you look at products liability, or what most of the litigation to date in this space has revolved within, if you look at the responsibilities of manufacturers as a whole, I would argue they fall into three major buckets. And this is pesticide manufacturers, product manufacturers of all shapes and sizes in the generality. There are really three legs of that stool. So a manufacturer has a responsibility to design a safe and effective product, right? So it does what it's supposed to do, and it does so in a safe fashion. They also, second leg of this stool, have a responsibility to manufacture that product according to those design standards. The third leg of that stool, or third responsibility, is that they have the responsibility to label or warn of inherent dangers, or known, those known known pieces associated with that product for consumers. All of those responsibilities are what kind of make up products liability. What we're working on, and what we're focused specifically on, is that third leg of the stool of what necessitates, or what satisfies an adequate warning. Right now, that is broadly interpreted. In fact, we sit in a situation across the United States where courts haven't interpreted what is adequate or what is sufficient a variety of different ways. So it puts manufacturers, really, what I would argue, between a rock and a hard place to figure out how do they satisfy that necessity. The crux of the legislation at its core that we're working on, in our home state of Iowa, as well as other states across the country right now, is very specifically to say that if a pesticide manufacturer has gotten an EPA label, through the FIFRA process, the Federal Insecticide, Fungicide, and Rodenticide Act, right, the overarching regulatory process, if they've been issued a label, which is kind of their permit to operate, or their permit to bring the product forward, that satisfies that duty. Right. It doesn't negate that duty. So unfortunately, we have many folks out there that are painting this effort through a lens of some type of immunity or shielding from responsibility. And that just frankly isn't the case. Manufacturers at the end of the day have the same responsibilities, right? The three legs of that stool to design something, to manufacture something, and warn, as they do after these bills are signed into law. What this effort does is just provide some clarity for how a manufacturer can satisfy that warning requirement. The other thing that I think is incredibly important for people to understand is that it does not take away from individuals' ability to sue if you are harmed by products, right? So if a product is not safe and causes harm, that pathway or that cause of action to the courthouse to sue, that absolutely still exists.
But it's the individual, and that might, right, as a versus the larger collection of litigants that come forward in a large group. Is that the delineation I'm hearing you talk about?
I don't think that that would change any of their ability to do what we've called like class actions, where you kind of bundle a lot of plaintiffs from a lot of different places. If all of those individuals were truly harmed by a product, they could continue to bring a cause of action, be it a single plaintiff or a class action of that sort. So, what we are focused on specifically is providing clarity and consistency on the label specifically, right?
Let's go back also to something you said in the beginning of that last answer, was the different interpretations of courts or different interpretations from maybe a legislature to. That's what our legal system is. What a certain district or circuit will allow or object to or send back to another jurisdiction is kind of the way all these laws are built. And I mean, is the ultimate thing need to happen? I mean, we talk about local control is like local court. That doesn't exist. We all think the Supreme Court is the final rule. But in all of this, though, Elizabeth, there's always that uncertainty of what a farmer or producer or a company is supposed to do and how they're supposed to operate. Does this help clear up some of that time, clear up some of that uncertainty for everybody involved?
I would argue yes, and I think the farm community is seeing that too, and I think that's exhibited by the cross section and the broad swath of organizations that have joined the modern ag effort and are advocating for these bills in these states and are signing on to letters to stress the importance of this topic in state houses, as well as some of our work that we've done out in Washington D.C. Just to kind of put a finer point on it, of what really the challenge I said rock in a hard place before, but we sit in a situation right now where the legal community has said we are going to continue to sue manufacturers in agriculture until you add these, cancer warning labels or disclaimers or whatnot onto your products. On the other hand, you have our regulator, the EPA, that has said we do not allow warnings or disclaimers that have no scientific justification. In fact, in 2019, the EPA put out a press release and a statement that said, we will not register glyphosate products that have cancer warning labels because it will be deemed misbranding. And if your product is misbranded, you do not get to register it, and thus you cannot bring it to market. So manufacturers really sit right now in a world where you either acquiesce to just the constant barrage of litigation or you change your label, at which point the EPA is going to, pull your product from the market effectively. So this clarity is not only important, it's necessary.
But does the average consumer understand that difference?
That's a good question. I think, the good thing about agriculture is that most of the folks that are handling these products, state by state, those requirements, change, but for the most part, there are some type of, pesticide applicator trainings or certifications that folks have to go through. They're almost beaten to their head, right, that the label is the law. Anyone that's gone through those trainings, that statement, makes their ears perk up, because that is kind of the foundational piece of these labels are important. And what is part of the labels is research, and it's there intentional and on purpose. What we found, then, going over to more of the Joe Public consumer, we actually did some polling work, Modern Ag did here in the last few months, just to try to gauge what does the general public understand about this topic. Do they see the litigation, as a challenge for a variety of different aspects moving forward, and then what are their sentiments about moving forward? And really what we found is it's not just rural America, right? The likes of those folks that are handling these products in an agronomic space each and every day, but Joe Public consumer wants farmers to be able to have the tools to be successful. And they recognize that this litigation that specifically in this sector is a threat to their ability to, cost effectively put food on their table. It impacts their dinner plate and their trip to the grocery store. They also are seeing this bigger picture. They're recognizing that food security is a key piece of national security, and those two things are very much intertwined. And so, that is rising on the attention of Joe Public. And I think one of the pieces that really stood out to me in part of that survey work is that not only do they recognize these challenges, but Joe Public wants legislators to act on it. What we found is 97% of farmers and 73% of just the general public actively wanted to see and support legislators that take action and support farmers on this topic. So, as we're going out and working with lawmakers, it's really important not only for them to understand kind of the fundamental challenges that exist here, but also to understand that their constituents are seeing this as well and they want action.
All right, we'll come back to the survey in a minute. I want to go back to the very beginning of that last answer. So that you talk about the applicator and the classes that the person who's putting on the chemical have to and handle it go through. What about, though, the person that is the neighbor to where this field is, whether it's in the country, in the edge of Albernet or Jessup, that how the edge of our towns are next to a farm
Yes.
field. And they might not know all of these things. And I guess then it does tie to the second part of your answer on the surveys. Are you talking to, what is the conversation you're having with those folks that are maybe not directly in agriculture on an education or information campaign about what it is that you're doing?
So I think exactly. So educating on just kind of the general public on what goes into the handling standards. If products that they were to buy, at your local home improvement store or lawn and garden store, right? You'd see big, thick labels on the sides of those products too. They go through the same kind of labeling and review process. Many of them have some of the similar active ingredients that farmers are handling, just in different quantities. Obviously, when you're talking about the square footage of a lawn or garden versus acres upon acres of farm fields. But the component pieces of we are doing an exceptional amount of education, not just of lawmakers, but also of the general public through, you mentioned, our billboards and TV ads and, social media, in just trying to build up the general awareness of how much goes into bringing a product from the lab to the field. And we're talking about, I think the last statistics that I had seen is that's generally about between 10 to 12 years, right? So from when a scientific concept is uncovered to when you'd see a true product on the shelf that is in response to that, is over a decade. The dollar figure on average attached to that, I think, is well over $300 million. So there is a wealth of research, investment, and outside due diligence, not just from the manufacturers themselves, but also from the independent researching community and the EPA that go into, the fundamental pieces of what's in this label. So while these may be 20, 30 pages long, at the end of the day, every component piece of that label has a wealth of research that's gone into it and is there on purpose. And so that's, I think, at the end of the day, why, this effort is so incredibly important, because the label is the law and the label is so critical.
Well, I think about the person, though, again, that might not, that might be impacted, whether it is their own lawn, but if they're a neighbor to, they see the farmer going out and spray and go, here they go again, another round of spray. And I'm not saying things drift or that end up in their groundwater. I mean, that's the easy answer to that question. But I mean, what's the conversation? Is that a person you need to win over in your argument?
I think that's a fair question. I think I would incorporate those folks into what we found in kind of the general public polling. I think, we found that people do trust farmers still too. That's to me not a shocking statistic, but that was something we also did in our polling is that people, while so many of us are becoming more and more, removed from the farm or removed from production agriculture, there is still absolutely a trust um, in farmers and knowing that they are what provides a critical part of our national security and through food security. So I do think that be it a neighbor, be it folks in town versus country, I still think that people do defer that farmers are good people and want to do the right thing and are doing the right thing, and that they want them to be able to continue to have those tools to be effective. Now, what goes into all of the depth and breadth of what those tools are and how those are vetted, I think that's a responsibility that sits on us that we are trying to go out and proactively educate upon.
Your polls that you say, I mean, I think there was, I seem to remember September, October, early November, there were people who were very leery of polls. They didn't believe anything like that. Um, your polling, though, could be very narrow to farmers. It might be easy to get 95% of them to agree on certain things. I have a hard time sometimes believing when I see polls that to hang all my things. Is that something? Uh, how do you satisfy that answer of I don't trust the polls?
Yeah, I'm with you. Numbers are all relative, right? And the numbers are important because they tell a story, and to what level you can put them in perspective. And that's something that I've always looked at, regardless of whether it's polling data or any type of statistic, is what ultimately does that data point help share? What does that help you conceptualize? And at the end of the day, whether it was, 80%, 90%, 82.7%, I don't know that the specific number matters, but the trend, right? And what we found is the trend not just in rural but in urban areas, not just in middle America, but from places like Florida, where we did some distilled down voting research, in places like North Dakota, all across that we found the same trends, and those trends being that folks recognize that these are critical tools. They may not fully understand what the tool itself is, but they understand that it's a critical piece to farmers, and that farmers' success is intricately tied to their ability to put food on the table.
And farmers, I mean, your Modern Ag Alliance, major amount of funding. I don't know if it's all. I assume it comes from a lot of those groups, but Bayer is a big funder of what you're doing. There's going to be a person who's going to see this or see your group and go, well, of course that's what they're for. It's for bottom line. It's for. How's that answer been for? Well, you're just funded by a big chemical company, so of course this is what you're saying.
Bayer is we're not we're Bayer is absolutely one of our partners. I tell folks that ask about that, their logo on this website is just the same size as all of the rest of the partners. So I am just as accountable to each of our corn growers and sugar beet growers and wheat growers and agribusiness groups as I am. Right there, there's a reason that those logos are all similarly situated. Is we want the voice of the farmer in this process, and you're seeing that play out in our political and policy efforts in each of these states, right? Sitting alongside our partners in Tennessee on their legislative effort, right? Sitting alongside our half a dozen partners up in Bismarck, North Dakota earlier this week as we were moving through the Senate process on the bill, and where there's two, I could name five more, and having conversations in a handful of other states where states are eager to pull these coalitions together to tee up these conversations with lawmakers. So I truly see Modern Ag as more of like a convening body that pulls all of these like-minded folks with similar priorities together to kind of collaborate and get something moving.
Looking at legislation and looking at bills. I'll talk specifically about the bill that went through the Iowa Senate because that's the bill that I get most of the emails on. And it's arguing that they're calling it an ag gag bill for cancer. That's why we want this legislation, is because we're shielding companies in case And I know asking a lawyer a question about hypotheticals is going to not get me anywhere, but it's a hypothetical of there's a group of people who tell me that this is just shielding if it's determined that certain things are causing cancer that might trace back to agriculture, that this is just a preemptive run to prevent large scale litigation against these large companies. Is that an accurate concern people have?
I think it's a consistent misrepresentation of what the language of the bill does. And back to where we kind of talked about and talked through the three kind of legs of that product's liability stool, what those three major responsibilities or duties of manufacturers are. I highlighted that duty for a safe and effective design, that duty to manufacture in a safe and effective fashion. Both of those pathways absolutely, in fact, all three of these pathways arguably still exist. It just argued what we are working on is clarifying how does one satisfy that warning label requirement? What is an adequate warning label? Right now, we don't have a definition. Once the bill is passed into law, we do. If someone is injured by a product, that pathway of defective product or harm, if that pathway to the courthouse absolutely still exists. If there's a bad batch of product that's manufactured wrong, that pathway absolutely still exists. So folks that are harmed by products absolutely have protection still under the law today, and they would after this bill is signed into law in every one of the jurisdictions that we're working in. This effort is purely focused on clarifying the label parameters.
They'd still have protections, but wouldn't there be a cap on what they could ask for in damages? Doesn't this cap it?
Damage caps are no, damage caps are separate. So each state also
Okay.
has a unique state law as to, and some states don't have damage caps, some states do. This legislation has nothing to do with any damage caps. This is truly very, very narrowly tailored. In fact, folks, that you can print off the bill on one sheet of paper, which is very rare these days. That is just how narrowly tailored and specific that it is.
Well, let's talk about the bill then. You mentioned I heard you say Tennessee, I heard you say North Dakota. We've talked about Iowa. What other states is this in the works or at least being introduced?
Sure. So I will give a nod to our friends down in Georgia. They were actually the first state this year to move it through both chambers. It's actually awaiting the governor's signature right now. So we saw a great bipartisan support on both sides. It moved unanimously through committees as well as bipartisan on the floor of the Senate and then the House here earlier this month. We saw an incredible support from North Dakota that moved unanimously through their committee on the House side. It was an 88-0 vote on the House floor. Again, when I say that this is a bipartisan issue, I think that vote in North Dakota, it showcases that to a T. We were just up there earlier this week to move through the Senate process there. We've got legislation that's been introduced in Oklahoma, Florida. I mentioned Tennessee. And I'm sure Missouri, excuse me. Yes, we've moved through the House as well in Missouri and are working our way through the Senate side conversations there. There are a handful of states also that had begun to consider this legislation, but just like, we have a funnel process in the state of Iowa where certain things need to be considered or brought up by a certain date. Otherwise, they're considered dead for this session or this cycle. We had some states where the bill just wasn't brought up. And so while that's unfortunate, we'll keep our collaborations kind of together and maybe tee up those conversations come this time next year.
I hear a lot of red states. I didn't hear Minnesota or Wisconsin, Michigan or has it been introduced there?
It has not. So I think the initial count was about 11 states. It is hard to do this effort everywhere all at once. It just, this many states is a lot to in part also because the state legislative sessions, for the most part, almost all coincide, right? So, the state of Florida being a different exception, they didn't start until I think like the first week of March which was nice to be able to, front load a few of these other states. But I think we wanted to be able to focus in some areas where, we had some boots on the ground partnerships already. We had already begun to have some of these conversations, and there was lawmakers that were interested in running this. So that network, I absolutely anticipate will continue to grow as we move into 2026 and beyond. Additionally, and I know we haven't talked about it at length just yet, but there is going to also be continuation of a federal effort on this topic. So there was legislation introduced in the last Congress entitled the Ag Labeling Uniformity Act. That was actually part of the House Farm Bill during the last Congress. So as we are getting back into, it feels a little deja vu-ish, right? Or Groundhog Day, right? Coming back to Farm Bill conversations year after year after year. But I fully anticipate that provision would be reintroduced and will be reintroduced this Congress. We haven't seen it yet, but I think they're still working on co-sponsors, and that would be a critical part of our 2025 Farm Bill conversations this year.
So not necessarily centered in ag states, but that are primarily row crop production that we have in Iowa and Missouri and North Dakota. Because when you mention Florida and Georgia and other things, but I mean, Illinois, Indiana, Kansas, I mean, all possible in the future?
I think absolutely. We've
If
got
the
great
federal
partners.
issue
We've got
isn't.
great partners in many of those states too. If I start rattling off the list, we'd unfortunately take all of our time on the podcast. But I would encourage folks to go on to modernagalliance.org and just take a scroll through just how broad and wide that list of partners is, state organizations and federal. And like I said, we've got great partners from coast to coast and beyond. And so looking forward to continuing to build that coalition and then build our outreach efforts as we move into, the next legislative cycles.
And the cycle never stops. You've probably got to get to the next meeting. So I will wrap it up that way, Elizabeth. Good to see you again. Thank you so much for the time. I appreciate it.
Always good to see you, Paul. Thanks so much for having me on.
My thanks to Elizabeth, and thank you. New episodes come out each and every Tuesday. Subscribe to the Market Insider newsletter to know all the cool things that are happening on Market to Market. We'll see you next time.